Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The last call.
It was nearing the end of my shift when they called me in. At first, I thought it was just going to be another routine autopsy, the kind I could do in my sleep. My name is Dr. Rachel Porter, and I've been a pathologist for over a decade. The morgue is my second home, a place where I'm surrounded by death every day. Most people can't handle it, but I've learned to numb myself to it. You have to. Otherwise, you'd go mad. I'd been preparing to clock out when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was steady but urgent. "Dr. Porter, we've got a new one for you. An unidentified body just came in. It's odd. We need you to take a look." I sighed, rolling my eyes. The hospital was always understaffed, and when you're the only pathologist on call, you don't get to pick and choose your cases. "Fine," I muttered. "I'll be there in a few minutes." The body was already prepped and waiting in the morgue when I arrived. The room was cold, the air thick with a sterile scent of antiseptic and decay. A sheet was draped over the body, its pale outline barely visible beneath. I stepped up to the table, grabbing my scalpel, ready to begin the usual process. Another nameless face. Another forgotten soul. I pulled the sheet back, and then my breath caught in my throat. It was him. I don't know what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The man lying on the slab looked exactly like David, my ex-boyfriend, the man who had disappeared 5 years ago without a trace. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands shaking slightly as I traced the outline of his face, staring at the familiar features. His angular jaw, the dark hair that had always fallen in front of his eyes, the slight dimple on his chin. How could this be? It didn't make sense. David had been missing for so long, presumed dead after a car accident. His body never recovered. I'd never gotten closure. He'd just vanished. And yet, here he was, lying cold and motionless on my autopsy table. I shook my head, trying to push away the disbelief that was creeping into my thoughts. This was some kind of mistake. I had to focus. It was just a coincidence, a man who looked like David, nothing more. I couldn't let myself get lost in old memories, no matter how painful they were. I had a job to do. I grabbed my scalpel and made the first incision, the cold steel slicing into his skin with a practiced hand. But as I did, something happened, a faint sound, a breath, barely perceptible. I froze. The room seemed to quiet as I stood there, staring at the incision I had just made. Had I imagined it? I leaned in closer, my heart racing now, pulse pounding in my ears. A soft, wheezing breath. It came from the body. No, David's body. It was impossible. But the sound was real. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe the body wasn't as lifeless as it seemed. Maybe it was some kind of reflex. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling for any sign of movement, any indication that I wasn't just imagining things. His skin was cold to the touch, yet there it was again. The breath. It was faint, but it was there. A slow, shallow exhale, like a sigh escaping from his lungs. My stomach churned, my thoughts spiraling. This couldn't be happening. I backed away from the table, my heart racing, the air suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, as if he knew me, as if he remembered me. But that was impossible, right? I shook my head, trying to calm myself. I had to finish the autopsy. I couldn't let panic take over. But as I moved closer to the table again, my hands shaking, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that I wasn't alone in the room. Something wasn't right. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell me this was all a joke. But the morgue was empty, save for me and the body on the slab. I focused again on the task at hand. I had to finish. But as I moved the scalpel toward him once more, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was imagining it. But no. There it was again, the slightest, almost mocking curl of his mouth. The smile seemed to widen as I stared, and I felt a chill run down my spine. My breathing quickened. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I couldn't breathe. The smile on his face, David's face, was growing. It was subtle at first, just a small twitch at the corners of his mouth, but now it was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate smile, curling at the edges like something out of a nightmare. I stepped back again, heart hammering in my chest. I had to be imagining it. There was no way a dead body could do that. I shook my head, trying to force logic back into my mind. Asterisk, he's dead. He's been dead for years, asterisk, but the more I stared at him, the more I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that he was still there, somehow, watching me, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to finish this. I was a professional. This wasn't the first time I'd seen a body exhibit signs of rigor mortis or nerve reactions after death. It was rare, sure, but it happened. I had to focus. But then my phone rang. The shrill sound sliced through the silence like a knife. I jumped, startled by the intrusion. My hands were trembling as I reached for the phone, my mind still racing from the unsettling sight in front of me. I glanced at the screen, and my blood ran cold. The caller ID read David. I froze. My stomach twisted. It was impossible. The man lying on the table, the one I had just confirmed was dead, couldn't be calling me. And yet, the name on the screen, the number, everything was his. For a moment, I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over the green button to answer. Every part of me screamed to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But the curiosity, the sheer terror that had been building inside me, overpowered any ounce of rational thought I had left. I answered the call. Rachel, the voice on the other end, was unmistakable. It was David's voice. His voice. But it was wrong. It was faint, like he was speaking through a heavy layer of static, as if something was distorting the sound. I could barely breathe as I held the phone to my ear. "David," I whispered, barely able to make the words come out. "Is that really you?" There was a pause, a long stretch of silence. And then he spoke again. "I know what you did, Rachel. I saw everything. You can't hide from me." I felt a shiver run through my body, my spine stiffening. The words made no sense. What was he talking about? What did he mean by that? My mind was spinning, each thought crashing into the next. Is this some kind of sick joke? The smile on his body. I turned slowly, my eyes unwillingly drifting back to the autopsy table. His lips were still twitching, the corners of his mouth stretching into something far too familiar, too knowing. "You didn't think you'd get away with it, did you?" His voice again, the the words cutting through the phone like a blade. "You left me to die, Rachel. And now, I'm going to make you remember." I stumbled back, my legs weak, my mind screaming. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had been the one to find David's car after the accident. The police had said it was a crash, an accident that had killed him. There had been no signs of foul play. But now, the words he was speaking, asterisk I left him to die asterisk, they didn't match the version of events I'd been living with all this time. I clutched the phone tighter, my breath ragged. "David, please," I said, my voice trembling. "You're dead. This isn't real. You're not real." But then, the voice on the other end of the line shifted. It went from faint to something far darker, more chilling. "Look at me, Rachel." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in my head, an order, a command. I didn't want to look back at the table. I didn't want to see what I was beginning to suspect. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned slowly, feeling the air in the room grow colder, heavier. My eyes moved down to the slab. And I swear to you, the smile on David's face widened. He was smiling. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I dropped the phone. It slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the call still connected. But I couldn't hear David anymore. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears, the rush of adrenaline pushing me into survival mode. I stumbled backward, feeling dizzy, lightheaded. Something was wrong. Everything about this, everything was wrong. My eyes flicked to the door, and for the first time in years, I felt truly trapped. The smile on David's face wasn't just a sign of some unnatural phenomenon. It was alive. It was a warning. I turned and bolted for the door, my mind reeling, my body on autopilot. But as I reached for the handle, I could have sworn I heard a whisper in the air behind me. David's voice, now clear, now sharp. "You can't escape me, Rachel." And then the lights flickered. I didn't stop running. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat like a drum of impending doom. I rushed toward the exit, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped the cold metal handle. The door, my escape, was just inches away, but it wouldn't open. I tugged harder, pulling with every ounce of strength I had, but it was as if the door was locked from the inside. "No, no, no," I muttered, panic rising in my throat. My breath was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I tried to turn the handle again, but the door remained obstinately shut. My thoughts were scattered, spinning out of control. I couldn't stay in here. Not with him. Not with David. I turned away from the door and looked back into the autopsy room. The table. The body. I hadn't imagined it. His smile was still there, still widening. The movement of his lips, the way they twitched and pulled back like something alive. It was him. A cold chill crawled up my spine as I realized the voice on the phone hadn't been some trick of the mind. It had been real. It had been him, somehow. And now, his body was... I couldn't even think about it. I backed away from the door, my legs feeling weak, the dizziness threatening to topple me. I knew I couldn't stay in this room much longer, but I also knew I couldn't leave. Something was keeping me here, something I couldn't understand, something far worse than any rational explanation could provide. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place, but the thought of stepping away from the table made my skin crawl. What if I turned my back again and... I couldn't finish the thought. I couldn't let myself. I grabbed the phone from the floor. My hands shook as I lifted it to my ear. No one could be calling again, right? It had to be a glitch. It couldn't possibly be. David Starr. The call had ended. But when I looked at the screen, the name was still there. His name. David. Oh. How was this possible? I swiped the screen, but the number wasn't one I recognized. It was a random string of digits. Then, the text appeared. Asterisk, you can't hide from me, Rachel. You never could. Asterisk. I dropped the phone in horror, the sound of it hitting the ground reverberating like a sickening reminder of what was happening. No matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up on me. This wasn't just a mistake, a trick of the mind. This was real. The smile, the call, the presence that seemed to be pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. Turning, I ran toward the window. My only thought was to escape. I wasn't going to stay in this suffocating room another second. But as I approached the window and pulled open the blinds, I froze. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw it. A shadow standing behind me. I whipped around, my stomach lurching. But there was nothing. Just the empty room. The body of David on the slab. No. I rushed back to the door. Desperation clawed at me as I slammed my shoulder against it. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. I could feel the pressure building, like the room was getting smaller with every passing second. Then, from behind me, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured. My breath caught in my throat. I knew those steps. I had heard them before. David. It had to be him. But he was dead. I spun around again, my heart thudding in my chest, but I saw nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the body. Just the smile. But now it was different. The smile was larger, more pronounced. Flesh was pulling back from the corners of his mouth like he was grinning. The skin stretched, revealing too many teeth, too many gums. I couldn't move. My body refused to cooperate, my legs like lead beneath me. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet were frozen to the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off the body. You left me, Rachel, the voice whispered, this time no longer from the phone, but from the body, from his mouth. Asterisk, you thought you could escape me, but you can't. Not now. Not ever. Asterisk. The room spun around me. My vision blurred, and I thought I might pass out. But I couldn't look away. I couldn't look anywhere else. And then, in the deepest pit of my stomach, I knew it. I was trapped. Not just physically, but in my mind. This wasn't going to stop. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. With a gut-wrenching scream, I tried to make a run for it. But the moment I turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. And the smile, David's smile was all I could see. He was here. And he wasn't leaving. Not this time. I can't breathe. I can't think. The weight of it all presses down on me like a suffocating blanket, cutting off my air, smothering every thought. I slam my hands against the door again and again, screaming, begging, but it doesn't matter. It won't open. No matter how hard I push or shove, the door won't give. And then there's that sound. The footsteps. Closer now. Slower. Closer and closer. They echo in the silence, each step making the hairs on my neck stand up, sending icy chills down my spine. I don't have to turn around to know what's coming. I can feel it. The presence is right behind me, so close I can almost hear his breath, the soft exhale of a body that shouldn't be here. I press my back to the door, trying to steady myself, to force my mind to work. Think, Rachel. Think, Dash. There's got to be a way out of here. But the terror is overwhelming. It's like a storm inside my chest, and no matter how hard I try to focus, the panic keeps rising, threatening to drown me. I close my eyes for a moment, trying to gather myself, but it's useless. The darkness behind my eyelids is replaced by his face. David's face. The way it looks now, stretched and grotesque, the smile. No, the grin, too wide, too much. I can't get it out of my head. It's like it's carved into the very walls of my mind, and every time I close my eyes, it gets deeper, more real. I shouldn't have answered the phone, Dash, I think, but it's too late. The damage has been done. I hear the sound again, closer, right behind me. I don't need to turn around. I already know he's there. I can feel him. I can feel his presence like a dark shadow draped over me, the air growing colder, colder with each second that passes. And then the voice. His voice. So familiar, yet distorted. I can hear it now, clear as day. Dash, you can't run from me, Rachel. You can't hide. I'll find you always. The voice is inside my head now, like a broken record repeating itself. His words sink deep, burrowing into my mind, taking root. I want to scream, to run, to break free from this nightmare, but my body won't move. My legs are paralyzed. My breath comes in short, shallow gasps. I feel like I'm drowning in the very air around me. A sound like a creak, his body shifting, moving. I don't have to look to know what's happening. I feel it. His fingers twitch. His hand twitches at his side as if he's preparing to reach for me. I can almost hear the sound of his skin sliding against the metal table, the subtle shift of his weight. And then, something that chills me to my core. I hear it, so clear and distinct that it feels like it's happening right beside me. The sound of breathing. The same shallow, raspy breath that I'd heard on the phone. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't my imagination. It's real. And it's coming from the body on the slab. I feel my heart thudding in my chest, my pulse racing, erratic. It's impossible. It can't be. But as I stand there, frozen in place, I can hear it again, louder this time. Inhalation, exhalation, a breath that shouldn't be there. I turn slowly, almost in a trance, against every instinct in me. I don't want to see him. I don't want to see the thing on the table, the twisted mockery of the man I once loved. But I have to. Something compels me, some sick curiosity mixed with dread. I can't stop myself. When I turn, I'm hit with the sight of it. His face, his smile, his eyes, half-lidded, staring into mine. And it's moving. His lips are twitching, stretching, pulling upward as if he's trying to smile. The eyes, those cold, empty eyes, are somehow aware, alive. My breath catches in my throat. I'm paralyzed. My body refuses to respond. I can't scream. I can't run. The grin is widening, the mouth opening just a little, revealing teeth that look too sharp, too wrong. I can hear his voice again, this time clear and mocking. It cuts through the air like a razor. I told you I'd find you, Rachel. You think you're safe, but you're not. You're never safe. Not from me. I try to pull myself together, but my legs won't cooperate. I stumble backward, gasping for breath, my hands searching for something to steady me, anything to hold on to. But there's nothing. There's only the body, the face, the smile. Too wide, too perfect, too horrifying. And then, the final blow. I see him move. His fingers, twitching, curling, clenching into a fist. His arm raises slightly, just a fraction, as though he's trying to reach for me. I feel the room spinning, the walls closing in. I can't take it anymore. I need to get out. I have to get out. Please, please, God. I turn, stumbling toward the door again. I don't care if it doesn't open. I don't care if I'm locked in here forever. I need to escape. I need to get away from him, from this thing. And then, with a violent pull, the door bursts open. I'm not sure if I've broken it down or if someone else opened it. I don't care. I run out of that room like my life depends on it, because it does. But even as I run, even as I make my way through the cold, sterile hallways of the morgue, I know one terrifying thing. He's following me, and he's never going to stop. I don't know how I made it out of the morgue. My mind feels like it's unraveling, thread by thread, each second slipping further away from me. I remember running, my footsteps echoing in the sterile, cold hallways, but everything else after that is a blur. My hands shake so badly that I can barely hold onto my keys as I rush to my car. The moment I slide into the driver's seat, I lock the doors and sit there for a long time, gasping for breath. My hands clutch the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turn white. The world outside is dark, just a stretch of empty parking lot illuminated by the faint, flickering lights overhead. But it feels suffocating, like the darkness is closing in, tightening around me. I don't dare to look behind me. I don't dare to look out the windows. I just want to drive away, as far as I can. Away from this place. Away from the body, the smile, the voice. But even as I start the engine, something pulls at me. A whisper in the back of my mind. That voice. His voice. It's there again, and I can hear it as clearly as if he's sitting right next to me. You can't escape me, Rachel. I'll always find you. I slam my hands onto the steering wheel, trying to block it out, but it's no use. It's inside my head now, looping over and over, each word like a physical blow. I pull out of the parking lot, my foot pressing harder on the gas than I intend, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I'm terrified to look, but I can't stop myself. I need to see. I need to know that he's not there. At first, it's just darkness behind me. Just the empty road stretching out into the night. But then, I see it. The shadow. It's there, right behind me, so faint I almost think I imagined it. But no. It's real. The outline of a figure. Too tall. Too familiar. And then, I hear it. The soft, raspy breath. The same breath that I'd heard earlier, in the morgue. It's coming from somewhere behind me, right outside my window. I slam my foot down on the accelerator, speeding down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so hard it feels like they might snap off. The car roars as I push it faster, faster, as though outrunning the nightmare will somehow make it go away. But then, there it is again, The voice. You can't outrun me, Rachel. It's so close now. Too close. My heart pounds in my chest, my breathing shallow, erratic. I can't think. I can't focus. It's like I'm losing myself piece by piece, slipping further into the madness. I'm shaking, my vision blurring as I force myself to keep driving, to keep moving, but the road feels endless. Just keep driving, Rachel. Just keep going. But even as I tell myself that, I know the truth. No matter how far I drive, no matter how fast I go, I'll never be free of this. The thing I saw on that table, the thing I heard on the phone, it's not just in my past, it's in my mind. And now it's in the very air around me. The phone rings again. I don't have to check the caller ID. I know who it is. I want to ignore it. I want to throw the phone out the window and pretend that none of this is happening. But I can't. My hand moves before I can stop it, and I answer, knowing what I'm about to hear. Dash, I'm right behind you. I freeze. My pulse crashes into my throat, and I can't breathe. His voice, so calm, so sure, like he's been there the whole time. And maybe he has been. I turn to the rearview mirror again, dreading what I'll see, but unable to stop myself. The shadow is closer now, closer than before. A face in the darkness. His face. David's face. I slam on the brakes, skidding to a halt in the middle of the road, the sound of rubber against asphalt screeching in my ears. But it's too late. He's here. The car stops, but my heart is still racing, beating out of control. The world around me is silent now. Everything feels too still, too empty. And then, just as I'm about to open the door and run, I hear something that makes my blood run cold. The sound of a phone ringing. My phone. But it's not coming from the car. It's coming from behind me. I turn, but there's nothing. Nothing except the pitch-black night. And then I hear the voice again, too soft to be real. Dash, I'm not done with you, Rachel. And the last thing I feel, as the darkness swallows me whole, is the sickening chill of his fingers brushing against my neck. I know it's over, and I know he's never going to stop.
The body that smiles.
I'd been in the job long enough that nothing was supposed to faze me. Nights in the morgue can get eerie, sure, but I'd grown accustomed to it. The sterile walls, the soft hum of the refrigeration units, the smell of antiseptic that seemed to cling to my skin even after I left. It was just another night, another routine autopsy. The body I was working on was male, late 30s. Cause of death wasn't anything unusual. A car accident, they'd said. Nothing mysterious about it. I went through my usual routine, dictating observations into the recorder, my voice bouncing back to me in the cold, empty room. I'd done this 1,000 times. It was second nature by now. As I made my initial incision, though, I noticed something odd. Just the faintest hint of a smile on his face. It wasn't something I'd seen before, not like this. People sometimes held strange expressions in death, but this one felt different. I stepped back, blinking, then leaned in to get a closer look. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought, and I chuckled nervously, dismissing it as nothing more than my imagination getting the best of me. But as I resumed the incision, I swear I saw that expression shift, the corners of his mouth curling just slightly higher. I stopped, my heart thudding a little too hard in my chest. The room felt colder, and for a moment, the silence seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. I forced myself to focus, to keep moving, to ignore the unnerving sensation creeping over me. "It's just a trick of the light," I murmured under my breath, but the words did little to reassure me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone. I found myself glancing around the room, half expecting to see something. But of course, it was just me and the body. I laughed to myself, a hollow, shaky sound that echoed off the sterile walls. Yet, every time I looked back down, that faint smile was there, taunting me. It was as though the corpse was in on some secret, some twisted joke that I couldn't understand. A chill crept up my spine, settling at the base of my neck. I knew I had to keep going, had to finish, but a voice in the back of my mind kept whispering, telling me to walk away, to leave this one for someone else. Ignoring the growing dread, I pressed on, but the smile seemed to grow with each incision, subtle but unmistakable. It was almost as if he were pleased with my work, watching with a kind of quiet approval. My hands trembled as I reached for the next tool. The feeling of that smile burned into my mind. By the time I finished the procedure, the smile was unmistakable. It was wide now, like some twisted grin, one that no longer felt passive. I found myself holding my breath, leaning over the body as if it might leap up at me any moment. And then, in that cold, silent room, the thought struck me. I could have sworn the smile had been smaller when I'd started. I took a deep, shaky breath and tore my gaze away, my mind scrambling for some reasonable explanation, some way to explain what I'd just seen. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't get the image of that smiling corpse out of my head. I thought I could shake it off. I really did. After I'd closed up the body and finished my paperwork, I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my mind. It was just a weird anomaly, right? A trick of the light, or maybe even the body's natural post-mortem rigor. But even as I left the morgue that night, I couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong. The smile. No, it wasn't just a smile. It was an expression that seemed to have a life of its own, kept flashing in my mind. It was like I could still see it, still feel it watching me. I had a long drive home, and I thought maybe some fresh air, some time away from the hospital, would clear my head. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself with music or focus on the road ahead, that smile followed me. I parked my car in my driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows of my house. The silence of the night was suffocating. My mind was racing. Why was I so affected by this? I'd performed hundreds of autopsies in my career, seen much worse things than a slight grin on a dead man's face. But this felt different. It wasn't just the physical smile, it was the feeling behind it, as if it were mocking me, waiting for me to understand something I wasn't meant to. I shook my head, telling myself to stop being irrational. I needed rest. I was just tired. But as I walked inside, the walls of my house felt too close. The house that had always been a place of calm now felt suffocating. I turned on the lights and moved through the darkened rooms like a ghost, trying to find some semblance of comfort in the familiar. But the smile was still there, like it was imprinted on my mind. Later that night, after I'd finally gone to bed, I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep to take me away from the unease. But as soon as I drifted off, it came to me again. The body. The smile. Only this time, it was more vivid, more pronounced. I was back in the morgue, the sterile cold of the room wrapping around me like a vice. The body lay on the table, and as I moved closer to examine it, I saw it again, the smile widening, stretching unnaturally as I reached for the scalpel. It was like it was waiting for me to make the next incision, urging me to continue. I stepped closer, heart pounding, but before I could make a move, I heard a low chuckle just behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. The room was empty, silent. The body was still there, but it was different. The smile had grown, as if the mouth was stretching beyond what should have been possible, splitting the skin. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't stop myself from staring at the contorted expression, as if it were drawing me in, making me a part of it. I woke up with a start, my sheets tangled around me. I sat up in bed, gasping for air. Sweat soaked through my clothes, and my pulse hammered in my chest. My hands trembled as I wiped my face, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of the nightmare. But then I saw it. In the dim light of my bedroom, just beyond my bed, I caught the faintest reflection of something in the mirror. My heart stopped in my chest. It was a face, smiling, but it wasn't mine. I jumped out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady. I rushed to the mirror, my breathing shallow, my mind screaming at me to look away. But I couldn't. The reflection was there, just behind me, impossibly wide, stretched into an exaggerated grin, the kind of smile no living person could make. I spun around, but of course, there was nothing. No one. I turned back to the mirror. The face was gone, but I could still feel it there, watching me. I tried to calm myself. It was a trick of the light. It had to be. But deep down I knew. I knew it wasn't just the mirror. It wasn't just a trick. The smile had followed me here, to my own home. And somehow, I felt it would never leave me. I couldn't escape it. I thought I was going crazy, but everything seemed to be connected to that damn smile. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it followed me. It wasn't just at night, or in my dreams anymore. It was during the day too. The first time I noticed it, I was at work. I was in the middle of a routine checkup, looking through some files in my office when I saw it. The smile. It wasn't just an image. It was more like a presence, an aura hanging in the air. I looked up from the paperwork, certain that I was just imagining things, but no. Across the room, a face on the wall seemed to grin at me. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It was just a picture. A stock photo of some family, smiling at the camera. But that smile, the same one from the morgue, was there. The corners of the mouth were unnaturally sharp, stretching like they were trying to tear through the skin. My pulse quickened, and I turned away, trying to focus on the task at hand. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feeling became. It wasn't just the smile I was seeing now. It was a sense of being watched, being stalked by something that couldn't be real. And yet, every time I looked around, I caught glimpses of it, like it was just on the edge of my vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I thought I was losing my mind. That night, as I sat in my living room, I tried to calm myself. I needed to rest. I couldn't keep running from this, whatever this was. I turned on the TV, hoping the distraction would clear my thoughts. But the second I looked at the screen, there it was again. The smile. On the characters in the show. In the commercials. On random people's faces. No matter what I watched, it was everywhere. I tried changing the channel, switching off the TV, but the smile didn't stop. It was like it had taken on a life of its own, as if it were imprinted on every person I saw, every image I looked at. I bolted up from the couch, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I needed to leave, to go somewhere, anywhere. But when I opened the door to go outside, I froze. The smile was on the faces of everyone walking down the street. Some of them weren't even real people, just reflections in windows, shadows in alleyways, but their smiles, they all seemed the same. As if they knew something I didn't, as if they were all part of the same twisted joke. I ran back inside, locked the door behind me, and sank to the floor, clutching my head in my hands. "This isn't real," I whispered, over and over again. "It's not real." It's just in my head. But the smile, it wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Every time I tried to escape, it found me. I couldn't tell if I was hallucinating anymore, or if something, something had attached itself to me. I wasn't sure where the nightmare ended and reality began. All I knew was that I was being hunted by this thing. Whatever it was. Whatever it wanted. I thought about the body. The smile. The way it stretched and shifted as I cut into it. Was this some kind of curse? Some kind of punishment for disturbing the dead? I had to find out. I had to know if this was all just in my head, or if something much darker was happening. The next day, I returned to the morgue. I told myself I was just going back to work. I had to, right? It was the only place where I felt some semblance of control. But as I walked through the hallways, past the rows of cold storage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That someone was right behind me, just out of reach. I made my way to the autopsy room, and there it was, the body. The one I'd worked on. The one with the smile. I froze in the doorway, staring at it. The table was empty. The body was gone. And then I heard it. A soft, wet chuckle, coming from the shadows behind me. My heart stopped. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I had to see. But when I turned, nothing. Just empty space. Silence. The chuckle echoed again, this time from somewhere closer, as if it were right behind me. I ran out of the room, my feet slapping against the cold tiles. I didn't care who saw me or what they thought. I had to get out. But as I reached the exit, I saw it one last time. The smile. On every face in the hallway. I didn't know how to make sense of what was happening anymore. It was as if reality itself was warping around me, and I was powerless to stop it. I couldn't tell if I was hallucinating or if something had attached itself to me, but the more I tried to escape, the worse it became. I left the morgue that day in a daze, still hearing that laugh echoing in my head. The kind of laugh that wasn't just sound. It felt like a presence, creeping over me, wrapping around my throat, choking me. I couldn't shake it. The smile had followed me into every part of my life, even the most mundane moments. The people around me, strangers on the street, co-workers at the hospital, everyone's face was slowly turning into that grotesque grin. It was like I couldn't trust anyone's face anymore. At night, I could still feel it, like it was waiting for me in the dark corners of my room. I stopped sleeping, hoping the fatigue would somehow make it go away, but I was only getting more and more paranoid. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, wondering if I would wake up to find that smile lingering at the edge of my vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. One night, exhausted and desperate for answers, I went back to the morgue. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue as to what was happening to me. I had to know what was real and what wasn't. I couldn't keep living like this. I slipped into the morgue after hours, the building eerily quiet as I walked down the familiar hallways. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, but now it felt stifling, like the very atmosphere was choking me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a curse? Was I being punished for disturbing the dead? Or was it something else entirely? I made my way to the autopsy room, my feet dragging as if the weight of my own fear was holding me back. When I opened the door, I froze. The room was just as I'd left it, sterile and cold, with a metal table in the center. But something was different. The body I'd autopsied was back on the table. The very same body. The same expression. That same, creeping smile, now twisted beyond recognition. I couldn't breathe. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the scalpel. But the second my fingers brushed against the handle, I heard it again. That laugh. It was so close this time, so real, that it made my stomach lurch. I looked up, but there was no one there. No shadow, no figure in the corner of the room. Yet, I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I bolted down the hall, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs giving way beneath me. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached the front door, my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't look behind me. I knew it would be there. That thing was following me, closer than ever. When I finally stepped outside into the cold night air, I thought I'd escaped it. But even the streetlights seemed to flicker with that same oppressive energy, like they were hiding something watching me from the shadows. I hurried back to my car, but as I drove through the empty streets, I began to notice something terrifying. Faces. Everywhere. They weren't people I knew. They weren't anyone I had ever seen before. They were just faces. But they were smiling. All of them. Grinning at me, watching me from the corners of my eyes, from windows, from street signs. Some faces were normal at first, but as I looked longer, their smiles stretched wider, unnaturally wide. Eyes glinted with malice. I could feel them. The smile was everywhere now. It wasn't just a part of me anymore. It was a part of everything. I couldn't escape it. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt as I pulled over. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating, like I was being smothered by the weight of it all. My eyes darted around the car, checking every corner, every shadow. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and then I saw it. A face, right behind me, in the back seat. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't just a smile. It was my face. But it wasn't mine anymore. The expression was twisted, like a mockery of my own features. The eyes were wide, empty and hollow, and the mouth. It was stretching. Stretching. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. The last thing I heard before everything went black was that laugh. That soft, wet chuckle. And then silence. When I woke up, I wasn't sure where I was. I wasn't in my car anymore. I wasn't even in the morgue. Everything was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive darkness that seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't see anything clearly. All I could hear was the faintest sound of breathing, my own or something else. I wasn't sure anymore. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed, like it was no longer my own. I couldn't lift my arms or legs. I couldn't even blink. Everything felt distant, unreal. A low buzzing hum filled my ears, and I realized it was the sound of a laugh. Soft at first, but it grew louder. Closer. That damn laugh again. Suddenly, the darkness around me started to shift, and through the haze, I could make out shapes. Shadows. People. They were all around me, standing still, their faces hidden in the shadows. Asterisk, but their smiles, I could see those clearly star. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, but my mind was racing. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. The laughter echoed louder now, bouncing off the walls, closing in on me. and then it stopped. Dead silence. The pressure on my chest lifted for just a second, and I could breathe again. I could move. But I didn't want to. Because in the silence, I heard it. Asterisk the whisper star. So soft. So close. It was my voice. But it wasn't. Smile, it whispered. I froze. I didn't want to smile. I couldn't smile. But it was like my face was being pulled into a grin against my will. My lips tugged upward, the muscles in my face twitching, stretching unnaturally wide. The grin was too big. It was wrong. It didn't feel like mine. It wasn't me. I wanted to scream, to claw at my own face, to rip it off if I had to. But my hands were still bound to whatever this was, and I couldn't move. Smile. The whisper came again, only this time, it wasn't just in my head. I felt it. I felt it on my skin, in my bones. The command to smile was everywhere, in everything. It was like the walls themselves were alive with it, suffocating me, pushing me further into madness. I tried to close my mouth, to resist, but the smile grew. It spread across my face, twisting my features into something grotesque. The faces around me were doing the same, their eyes empty and gleaming, their mouths stretched wide in that horrific, mocking smile. I realized then that I was no longer alone. The morgue, the autopsy room, the faces from the street, they were all here, in this place. They were all waiting for me to join them. Smile, the whisper said once more, but this time I couldn't tell if it was in my head or if it was coming from the faces surrounding me. The grin was consuming me. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't fight it. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, towering over the others, and it stepped toward me slowly, deliberately. Its face was mine. But it wasn't. Its eyes were empty, hollowed out, and that smile, it was the same as the one I had seen in the body I had autopsied. The smile was stretched beyond reason, beyond what was humanly possible. The figure's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and from it came a sound that wasn't laughter, but a low, guttural growl. A sound that chilled me to my core. I couldn't look away. I couldn't look anywhere else. The figure reached out, its cold hand brushing against my cheek, and for the first time I felt the chill of death itself. And then I understood. The figure wasn't just the smile. The smile was part of it. The figure was the smile. It was everywhere, in everyone, in everything. It was me. I was no longer just a victim. I was part of it now. I had become the smile. As my face stretched further, wider, I felt the last shred of myself slip away. The grin took over completely. And then the laughter returned, louder than ever. It was my laugh. But it wasn't. It was a laugh that would never stop. And as I faded into the darkness, I knew one thing for sure. There was no escaping the smile. It was in me, and it was going to keep spreading, forever.
The last breath.
My nights are filled with silence. Thick, almost tangible silence that hangs heavy in the air, draped across the small, dimly lit room where I perform my work. You'd think after years of working as a medical examiner, I'd have grown numb to it all. The stillness, the cold, the dead eyes staring back at me. It's strange, I suppose, how someone can get used to the quiet companionship of the deceased. They're predictable, at least, never resisting the inevitable work I have to perform. Tonight seemed like any other, just another routine autopsy, the clock ticking lazily past midnight. Outside, a light rain had started, pattering softly against the window, its sound almost comforting as I prepared for the next body. The man on my table was unknown, his details not matching any records yet. Mid-30s, tall, with that lifeless pallor that I'd seen hundreds of times. He'd been found slumped over in his car by the river. No obvious cause of death, no signs of trauma, nothing. It was just him and me now, under the faint, sterile light, and I was about to find out what had brought him here. I took a deep breath, my gloved hand steady, and made the first incision down his chest. The air should have been completely still, the kind of silence I had grown accustomed to, but then, out of nowhere, came the softest, most fragile sound, a sigh, faint and almost imperceptible. I froze, my hand hovering over the incision, my ears straining to catch any further noise. But it was gone. Just a figment of my imagination, I told myself. It wasn't unusual for the air to escape a body as the incisions were made. It was just one of those strange quirks of human anatomy that I'd seen a dozen times before. And yet, this felt different, almost too human. I swallowed hard, and the familiar clinical calm I prided myself on began to waver. The silence around me felt heavier, denser. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, almost alive in the dim light. Shaking off the unease, I continued the procedure, forcing myself to focus. My fingers worked methodically, like a machine, but I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. Something about this body felt wrong, as if it were resisting me in some invisible, silent way. I leaned in closer, examining his face, as though searching for answers in his empty, half-lidded eyes. But then, without warning, his eyelids twitched. I jerked back, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I must have imagined it, I told myself. The muscles sometimes reacted during an autopsy. It wasn't entirely unheard of. But deep down, that flicker of movement stayed with me, clinging to my thoughts like a shadow. I needed to finish. Just finish and leave. The quicker I wrapped this up, the sooner I could get out of here, leave him behind, and maybe even laugh about it all in the morning. But as I picked up the scalpel to continue, I felt a strange urge to look into his eyes again, as if he were beckoning me back. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and dread, unsure of what I'd find staring back at me. But curiosity won, and slowly, almost against my will, I glanced up. His eyes were open, wider this time, and staring directly at me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might drown out every sound in the room. I stood there, scalpel in hand, staring back at those cold, lifeless eyes, except they didn't seem so lifeless anymore. They were open, focused on me, almost aware. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was some kind of trick of the light, a delayed reaction. Bodies did strange things sometimes, after all. But the sensation gnawing at my gut told me something about this was different. I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself of my training, of logic. I was a medical examiner. I'd seen cadavers shift, twitch, and even produce sounds. Rigor mortis could make muscles stiff, and sometimes those muscles relaxed later. Nothing supernatural, just science. I was simply tired, my imagination working overtime. But then his fingers twitched. First, just the index finger on his right hand, barely noticeable, like a single pulse. I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, my gaze trapped on his hand. Before I could gather my thoughts, his whole hand curled, then released, like he was stretching from a deep sleep. The room suddenly felt colder, and an icy shiver crawled up my spine. This couldn't be happening. I staggered back, my back colliding with the stainless steel counter behind me, my fingers pressing against the cold metal as if anchoring myself to reality. "It's just nerves," I whispered, my voice trembling, bouncing back to me from the walls of the empty room. But as I whispered, his lips parted, and that faint sigh I'd heard earlier filled the air again, softer but unmistakable. My mouth went dry, and I felt a pressure building in my chest. I needed to get out of here, to turn around, leave the room, call for help, something. But I didn't move. It was as if I were paralyzed, anchored by some unseen force, compelled to keep watching this corpse. No, this man, who should have been beyond any earthly awareness. His eyelids twitched again, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I could have sworn he blinked. Everything inside me screamed to look away, to flee, but I felt rooted to the spot, my gaze locked onto his. That's when I saw his chest rise. Just a fraction of an inch, but unmistakably, a faint, shallow breath. The air left my lungs in a shuddering gasp, and I gripped the counter behind me so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every rational thought, every scientific principle I'd ever learned began to melt away, leaving only raw, primal fear. "No, this isn't possible," I whispered, shaking my head as if I could somehow dispel the nightmare unfolding before me. But as I watched, his chest rose again, a slow, agonizing inhale, as though he were taking his first breaths in a long, dark eternity. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows over his face, making his eyes appear even darker, more knowing. Finally, something in me snapped. I dropped the scalpel, letting it clatter loudly against the floor as I stumbled backward. But just as I turned to leave, the faintest sound stopped me in my tracks. A whisper, barely more than a breath, came from his lips. "Don't go." That whisper, so faint, yet so unmistakably real, froze me in place. My hand hovered above the door handle, fingers trembling as if they'd been struck by an electric current. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage, a relentless reminder of the unnatural horror unraveling behind me. Every instinct told me to run, to bolt from the room and never look back. But those two words, "Don't go," echoed in my mind, holding me captive. I turned slowly, against every ounce of logic I had left, and met his gaze again. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked onto me, seeming to pull me into a void of silent agony. I could feel the air growing colder, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in around us. He didn't move, but his presence seemed to grow, filling every corner of the room, seeping into my mind. 1,000 explanations flooded my thoughts, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, maybe some freak reaction of the body, or perhaps, just perhaps, I had finally lost my grip on reality, right here in this sterile, lifeless room. But he was still there, watching me. His eyes, once so dull, seemed to shimmer with something dark and inexplicable. And then, without warning, his mouth opened, just a fraction, and a rasping sound slipped through, each syllable scraping against the silence. "Help me!" The voice was rough, barely more than a hoarse breath, but I heard it as clearly as if he were speaking directly into my ear. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the tray of instruments, as the word echoed through the room, chilling me to the core. Help him. How could I possibly help someone who was beyond life, beyond the reach of any mortal aid? I wanted to scream, to shake myself awake from this living nightmare. But his pleading gaze pinned me to the spot, and I felt a strange compulsion, a twisted sense of duty, to do something, anything. I swallowed, the dry, metallic taste of fear thick on my tongue, and took a hesitant step forward. My voice, when it finally came, was barely louder than a whisper. What do you need?" I didn't know why I spoke. I didn't expect a response. But somehow, I needed to break the silence, to bridge the impossible distance between the living and the dead. His lips moved, forming words I could barely decipher. "Don't let them take me." I didn't understand. His gaze flickered, shifting as though he were seeing something far beyond me, something lurking in shadows I couldn't see. His face contorted, an expression of utter terror washing over it, and his mouth opened wider as if he were screaming silently at whatever horror he could see just beyond my reach. Then, with a sudden, violent shudder, his hand lifted from the table and grabbed my wrist. I gasped, frozen, feeling his cold, lifeless fingers curl around my skin with a grip that was anything but weak. I struggled, instinctively trying to pull away, but his hold was unbreakable, his hand clamped around my wrist like a vice. His eyes, wide and filled with desperation, locked onto mine with an intensity that pierced through every layer of fear and disbelief. "Don't let them take me," he hissed again, louder this time, the force of his words vibrating through the room, as if the walls themselves were listening. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of his words, but it was useless. The horror of his plea, the sight of his pale, unbreathing form gripping me so tightly, pushed me beyond thought. All I knew was that something, somewhere, was coming for him, and he was terrified of it. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief, shuddering darkness. And in those fleeting moments of blackness, I thought I saw shadows moving at the edges of the room, shifting and writhing like smoke, inching closer. The flickering lights cast twisted, moving shadows around the room, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. My heart hammered wildly as I tried to wrench my wrist from his grip, but he held on with a strength that defied any logic, any trace of humanity. His hand was ice-cold, a sensation that seemed to seep through my skin and into my bones. I was trapped in his grasp, forced to meet his desperate, terror-filled gaze. The shadows at the edge of the room seemed to grow thicker, heavier, like a dark fog seeping in through cracks unseen. They pulsed, taking on shapes that flickered in and out of focus, long, jagged fingers stretching toward us, eyeless faces twisting in silent agony. It was like the darkness itself had come alive, encircling us, slowly closing in. His mouth moved again, his words barely a whisper, each one laced with fear. They're here. Who's here?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding thin and hollow in the oppressive silence. "What's happening?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something beyond fear in his eyes. A look of recognition, as if he understood that I could see them too, that I was now a part of whatever terror had gripped him in his final moments. "They've come to take me," he murmured, his voice shaking. "And they'll take you too." A chill ran down my spine, and I finally yanked my wrist free from his grasp, stumbling back, nearly slipping on the sterile tile floor. The shadows shifted, their movements synchronized, as though they sensed my awareness of them. I could feel an invisible weight bearing down on me, pressing the air from my lungs, tightening around my chest like a vice. I backed up until I hit the counter, my hands gripping its cold edge, desperate for anything real to hold on to. The darkness around us thickened, the shadowy figures now clearly forming limbs, stretching arms toward me with clawed, elongated fingers. One of the shapes loomed closer, its mouth open in a silent scream, a black, endless void that seemed to pull every light, every sound into itself. My rational mind fought to regain control, struggling to explain the impossible terror before me. This couldn't be real. Shadows didn't move on their own. They didn't form faces and fingers. They didn't reach. But as I pressed myself harder against the counter, I felt the room itself shift, as if reality were peeling away, revealing something darker, more sinister just beneath the surface. In the dim light, I glanced back at the body on the table, hoping, irrationally, that he might somehow offer some clue, some way out of this nightmare. But what I saw chilled me even deeper. His head was turned toward me, his eyes wide open, but they looked different now, drained of the fear and desperation I'd seen moments before. Now, they held a strange, hollow calm, as if he'd surrendered to the inevitable. "You can't escape them," he whispered, his voice carrying an eerie finality. "Once they find you, they never let go." The shadows closed in, inches away from me now, tendrils of darkness reaching out, curling around my ankles, climbing up my legs, and filling every inch of the room with an oppressive weight that crushed any hope I'd clung to. I felt them crawling up my arms, cold and relentless, their presence wrapping around me like chains, each one tighter than the last. I screamed, thrashing against the darkness, but it was useless. The shadows seemed to absorb every sound, swallowing my voice before it could even echo in the room. My vision blurred as the darkness grew denser, coiling around my neck, pressing in on my throat until I could barely breathe. In my last moments of consciousness, I could feel him watching me, his hollow gaze fixed on me with a kind of eerie sympathy, as though he understood all too well what was happening. As my vision faded, I heard his voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing one last time in my mind. "Welcome to the darkness." When I came to, the cold was the first thing I felt, an unnatural chill that clung to me, deeper than skin, a cold that settled in my bones and whispered of things best left unseen. I blinked, struggling to see through the haze in my vision, but the room around me felt wrong. I was still in the morgue, but the walls were darker, the air heavier, saturated with a silence that seemed to press in from every side. I tried to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me, my mind swimming as fragments of what had happened flooded back. The shadows, the whispers, the feel of those icy tendrils wrapping around my limbs. It was all real, wasn't it? My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, half expecting to see those twisted, formless shapes closing in once again. But the room was empty, bathed in an eerie half-light, as if the overhead bulbs had dimmed just slightly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the walls. The body on the table, the one that had whispered, pleaded, grabbed me, was gone. All that remained was an empty metal slab, cold and pristine, as if nothing had ever been there. I staggered back, my heart hammering, my mind racing through possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. Had I imagined it all? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or the byproduct of too many late nights in this haunted, sterile room? I told myself that I must be losing my grip on reality, that there was no other explanation. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something scrawled in blood-red letters across the wall behind the metal slab, each letter crooked, dripping as though someone, or something, had written it with a trembling hand. Asterisk, they will come for you too. Asterisk. A chill shot down my spine, and I stumbled back, my gaze locked onto those words, my mind struggling to comprehend. It was impossible. I was alone when I'd blacked out. No one else could have entered this room. Yet the message was there, as real as the air I struggled to breathe. A loud, resonant click shattered the silence, and I whipped around, my pulse thundering. The door, my only way out, was slowly swinging shut. I bolted toward it, hands outstretched, reaching desperately as the door slammed closed with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. I grabbed the handle, yanking with every ounce of strength I had, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. My fingers clawed at the metal, the cold seeping into my hands as I pounded on the door, screaming for anyone, anyone, who might hear me. My voice echoed in the hollow space, swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, soft yet insistent, echoing from the far corner of the room. I turned, my breath catching as I strained to see into the shadows pooling at the edges of the dim light. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, each beat perfectly timed, like a heartbeat that echoed through the silence. And then, emerging from the shadows, I saw him, the man from the slab, standing just at the edge of the light, his hollow, lifeless eyes fixed on me with a calm intensity that froze me in place. He was exactly as I'd seen him before, the same ashen face, the same empty gaze. But now there was something else, something in his expression that twisted my stomach, a hint of satisfaction, as though he'd been waiting for me, knowing this moment was inevitable. I backed up, my shoulders pressing against the cold metal of the door, my only exit blocked by a force I couldn't hope to escape. The man stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, the tapping of his bare feet against the tile echoing in time with my pounding heartbeat. Why are you doing this?" My voice was barely a whisper, the words catching in my throat, but I had to ask, had to understand why I was trapped here, why he had singled me out for this torment. He stopped, his head tilting as he regarded me with a look that was almost pitying. When he spoke, his voice was softer, filled with a sadness that made my skin crawl. "Because they took everything from me. And now, they'll take you too." The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across his face, distorting his features until he looked more monster than man. I pressed myself harder against the door, my fingers digging into the metal as he raised his hand, pointing toward me with a finger that shook with rage, or was it sorrow? And then, just as the darkness began to gather around him again, he whispered one final, chilling word. "Run." The lights went out completely, plunging me into pitch-black darkness. The air grew thick, suffocating, filled with a cacophony of whispers, each one echoing from the shadows, overlapping, calling my name in a chorus of tortured voices. I could feel them closing in, the shadows crawling up my skin, dragging me down into their depths. I screamed, thrashing against the darkness, but it was no use. They pulled me under, into an endless void where there was no escape, no light, only the cold, endless whispers of the dead. And in my final moments, as the last traces of light faded, I realized the truth. I was no longer alone. I was one of them.